Hello, I'm Adam Wolfett, and I took all the photographs in this exhibition for a magazine story that the National Geographic published in 1970. This is the 50th anniversary of that story, and although I'm extremely sorry that I'm not here in person, I'm very, very glad that the exhibition has survived coronavirus. And for that I have to thank Helif Hammer, the museum director, and Ranva Winkler, the curator, who decided early on that it would survive and it would be presented at Olafsøka 2020, whatever happened. Now, the other person I've got to be very grateful to is my friend Christopher Lawton, who came here on a sailing trip in 2017 and at my request found a contact in the tourist board and through them a contact in the museum service. We arranged via email to come back and talk with them in 2018, and that was the occasion when I gave them my archive and when they said they would really like to do the exhibition. So that's the story behind the exhibition and how it came about. And now I'm going to tell you the story about how I came to be working for the National Geographic magazine. I started my professional life as a student at Guildford College when I was 17, and I studied hard there. I played hard as well, chatted up all the pretty girls, and did all the things a male student should do. And then after about 6 years when I'd left college, I had become a well-established photographer shooting for weekend magazines such as The Telegraph. Now in 1965, Sir Winston Churchill died, and his funeral was a huge and absolutely massive press event, and art editors, picture editors, photographers from all over the world converged on London to get coverage of the funeral, including Bob Gilco, who's director of photography at the National Geographic. And through the Telegraph, he got hold of my name because he was looking for additional local photographers to add to his coverage team. So he turned up at my damp basement studio and said, would I like to work for the day for the Geographic? And I said to him, I'm not available, because half an hour earlier I'd committed myself to work for the Telegraph, and I couldn't break that commitment, even for him. So when he left the studio 10 minutes later, I was in black, deep despair because I just refused the first assignment for the best photographic magazine in the world. And I really was in despair. But a month later, I got one of Bob's classic commissioning letters. They were typically very brief, and in my case, they held probably 3 paragraphs. Dear Adam, how are you and Penelope? Would you like to photograph the Faroe Islands? Please call me. And so I would call Bob and we'd have a brief talk on the phone. And in the early days, when I first worked for them, I would be flown over to Washington to meet the writer and the picture editor and generally get a feel for the story. I had to discover where they were, first of all. And my goodness me, they did look tiny. They are stuck there in the North Atlantic. And the second thing was to find out how to get there. So I took a ferry from England to Bergen, and I took a ferry from Bergen to Tórshavn, and there I was in the capital city of the Isles of Maybe. I took one look around me. I had only gone for a week anyway, just to have a quick recce and find out what was what. And it became absolutely apparent that I couldn't possibly do the story unless I had a car, a vehicle of my own. I went back to England, planned my next much longer trip, and took with me my own minivan, which was to stay with me throughout my coverage and eventually be left behind on the islands in payment of a hotel bill, which suited everyone very well. The hotel didn't have to pay import taxes, and I didn't have to wait 10 days to get home, because I was very keen to get home at that point. My final trip was in January 1969 for 10 days when I just went to get a taste of winter, a taste of your little islands in this vast North Atlantic, storms and snow and really harsh conditions. Standard issue when you started a story was a Halliburton pilot case which would hold up to 300 rolls of film. And there it was, full of 300 rolls of Kodachrome, and if I ran out of that, I would just send for more. And the second thing that was really noteworthy about the islands was that they were very friendly. They'd been occupied by a Scottish regiment during World War II to prevent them falling into German hands, and the regiment had gone on very well indeed and persuaded 170 girls to get married because they felt very at home in the islands, being, from the similar sort of climate and so on. Now, my best friend throughout my trips was a man called Osmund de Poulsen, and he worked in the telephone exchange, and he was also a photographer, and we travelled together to places I would never have found without him. So what did I particularly enjoy on the islands? Well, one thing, obviously, as a passionate bird watcher, was the bird life, which was quite extraordinary. I saw Arctic skuas on Skúvoy, which is named after the skuas, who've always nested there. I saw huge colonies of terns on Mykonos, and I even was able to photograph a snipe nesting beside a path from a range of about 3 meters. It was so tame. And of course I saw endless puffins, classic puffins. When I came to photograph the egg harvest on Skúvoy, I stayed with the headman, Johan Hense, and his family. He it was who had the responsibility to decide when the harvest could go ahead. 2 things were important. One was that the colony had time to lay another egg, so that the colony didn't diminish. And the second thing was, of course, the weather had to be right, because high winds or rain was absolutely lethal. The linesman could be 300 foot down the cliff, swaying about, and any wind would risk his life because he would be smashed against the cliffs. So we waited quite a while for the weather to come right, watching the deadline approach for the colony to have to lay another egg. And eventually it was okay. But in the meantime, I'd learnt to love the boats because I'd been out fishing with Johan's son and had fallen completely in love with the boats. What amazing craft. Flexible, they wove their way through the waves. Quite magical. So the day dawned and we were off. The harvest went ahead in 1 day, and I was reminded by somebody that during the wartime, when food was desperately short, in 1 year they'd gathered 35,000 eggs. That would never be done again because it threatened the colony. But at that time, 35,000 eggs was really important foodstuff for the islands. One of the pleasures of being in Johan's house was that he was able to show off his model boat to his grandchildren, young Johan and Ida, and I marvelled at his skills in this tiny, perfect scale model. So when I left Skúvoy, I went in search of a real-life boat builder and came to see Marius Clemenson on Sandoy, and he was making a full-size sexaringer, and I watched him working in absolute amazement as he was cutting 45-degree mitres across the end of 2-centimetre plank with a hand axe, a very sharp hand axe, and about 2,000 years of skill. And the other great treat was to be invited to the wedding in Kirkebur of the Patterson family, who owned the house that was once the Bishop's Palace, and they had a huge wedding party for everyone of importance on the island, and almost the only person not in traditional Faroese dress was the Prime Minister, and he was in a business suit with a very smart bow tie. After they'd had a little lubrication from 100-year-old snaps, they started to dance. And they danced and they danced and they danced one of the great circular dances. And the other critical thing that I saw was the grind, the whale hunt, and I'd been waiting for this desperately. I'd missed 2 already, one because I didn't get there in time, and one because I got there in time, but it was the middle of the night, so neither was any good to me. But eventually the phone rang one morning and Osmunda said from the telephone exchange, "Quick, quick, quick, there is a grind on Sorvagor." So in a mad rush to get there, I drove like a lunatic across 2 islands, leapt on the ferry and got there in time. And I shot roll after roll of film as this extraordinary sight unfolded. And the weather and the light was unbelievably in my favour. So when I'd shot that, I felt really pleased because that was such a key element of my entire coverage. The following day, I packed up my film, air freight, and sent it from the airport. And nothing. A week went by, 2 weeks went by. I sent another telegram. 3 weeks went by, and now I was in desperation. Finally, after 5 weeks, I get a cable back from the Geographic, from the film review room. The film has arrived, and it stinks of clipfisk. It had been thrown off the airplane because the plane was overweight, and it had gone by surface mail. My heart was able to beat again. So what were the most amazing things that I saw in the Faroes? Well, one was having a pony as a fellow traveller. One was eating roast puffin with raisins and schnapps, and the other was the extraordinary thing of seeing my car hauled on and off small ferries to get it between the islands. Of course, that's all changed now with tunnels everywhere. Towards the end of my coverage, I sent my wife a letter asking her permission to fall in love with an archipelago, because I had fallen in love with the islands, and after 50 years, I still am in love with them.